Hello, and welcome to Empower 2021. I'm Anne-Marie Maman, the Executive Director of the Princeton Entrepreneurship Council. I'd like us to kick off this year's conference by inviting Pablo de Benedetti to say a few words.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Empower 2021. I am truly delighted to welcome so many of you to this virtual conference. I'm especially pleased that the participants include people from around the country and from around the world, and that you represent the many different roles that are needed to make academic entrepreneurship reach its full potential. I am Pablo de Benedetti, Dean for Research at Princeton University, and I am very pleased to be the organizing host of this extraordinary conference celebrating Black academic entrepreneurs. Many of you may ask, why Princeton? Why now? Let me address these questions through selected examples. Our university is implementing an extraordinarily ambitious plan to make our campus more diverse, more representative of the country at large. For example, we have made significant progress in growing the diversity of our undergraduate student body. 18% of the first-year students who joined us on campus this year are first-generation college students. 22% qualify for federal Pell Grants for students with exceptional financial needs. And the average financial aid grant for the class of 2025 is greater than the cost of tuition. For many families, Princeton is now more affordable than the cost of state college or university. The diversity of background and outlooks allows our campus to be a fertile ground for richer discussions, research, and innovations. In June of 2020, in response to events that caused our country to enter a profound reckoning with racism, Princeton President Christopher Ice Gruber charged his senior leadership team to put together actionable plans to combat systemic racism at Princeton and beyond. Racial justice demanded the attention of this community of teaching and learning. Princeton contributes to the world through teaching and research of unsurpassed quality, and President Ice Gruber charged us to continue to find ways to bring that mission to bear against racism and against the discrimination that permeates the lives of people of color. This conference is part of a larger and much longer-term plans that will guide Princeton University as it takes an active role in helping to close gaps in opportunity, affordability, and representation. During this academic year, the Office of the Dean for Research will launch several programs designed to enhance the diversity of participation in research, innovation, and entrepreneurship at Princeton, also in collaboration with some of our peer institutions. I would like to describe to you a few of the initiatives that will enable diverse teams to produce high-quality research and innovations. First, we have developed a new research fund to support innovative academic collaborations between faculty and students at Princeton and faculty and students at select historically Black colleges and universities. We will fund research and innovation collaborations across all disciplines, spanning the sciences, engineering, humanities, and social sciences. Second, we will be launching a distinguished public lecture series called Amplifying Voices that will bring inspirational and underrepresented figures in research, innovation, and entrepreneurship to campus. This lecture series will enhance the welcoming nature of our campus and improve the experiences of all interested graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. Events coordinated around the lecture will be designed to provide mentoring and networking opportunities to graduate students and postdoctoral researchers, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. Importantly, graduate students and postdoctoral researchers will select the speakers. Our third initiative has been developed to boost inclusion of historically underrepresented people in entrepreneurship. The longer-term intent of this initiative is to reduce the racial wealth and opportunity gaps that we see throughout our country. This Empower 2021 conference is an example of programming developed with the objective of bringing together underrepresented thought leaders in entrepreneurship to discuss and share practices and community. As will be discussed during the conference, ecosystem building is difficult, and Princeton wants to be an active participant in developing more diverse ecosystems. And speaking of building strong, diverse ecosystems, Princeton is very pleased to have been recently named the principal institution for a new regional innovation hub funded by a $15 million grant from the National Science Foundation. In collaboration with other academic institutions in the Northeast, this 5-year grant will accelerate the transformation of scientific discoveries into technologies that improve everyday lives. Starting from its leadership team, the Northeast Innovation Core Hub has a demonstrated commitment to inclusivity and diversity, and to assist those who historically have faced barriers to opportunity in innovation and entrepreneurship. Affiliate institutions, including Delaware State University and HBCU institution, will co-lead the hub's efforts to partner with minority-serving institutions. Another program we're launching will translate Princeton University research into new high-impact ventures. The START program, as it will be called, will fund entrepreneurs for 12 months on campus, working with a faculty member engaged in translational research, and subsequently for an additional 18 months while working in our new Princeton Innovation Center biolabs. This is a co-working environment that provides shared office and lab space with strategic access to capital and industry partners. START entrepreneurs will work full-time as founders and will receive mentoring, entrepreneurship education, and funding through my offices. For this program, we're particularly encouraging members of groups who have been historically underfunded and underrepresented in academic entrepreneurship. The above are just some examples of the exciting work we're undertaking at Princeton as a community of teaching, learning, discovery, innovation, and entrepreneurship to make the world a better place through inclusion, equity, and diversity. I know that I speak not just for myself, but also for my many colleagues at Princeton when I say that I hope we will stay connected and that together we will do great things. It is truly exciting to have so many participants, actually more than 700 in this extraordinary event. And at this time, I would like to ask my distinguished colleague, Princeton's extraordinary inaugural Vice Dean for Innovation, the Pomeroy and Betty Perry Smith Professor of Chemical and Biological Engineering, Rodney Priestley, to say a few words. Rodney?
Thank you, Pablo, for the introductory remarks about Princeton's commitment and efforts to support more inclusion in research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Greetings, everyone, from Princeton, New Jersey. It is my honor to welcome you to Empower 2021, a conference celebrating Black academic entrepreneurship. It is clear that universities remain the center of knowledge generation in the United States and around the world. Evidence is also increasing that shows that academic institutions are producing a larger proportion of scientific and technological breakthroughs that can impact society in positive ways, as well as spur economic development for the communities in which they are based. In fact, universities are particularly well suited to serve as engines that can drive the convergence of research, innovation, and entrepreneurship to address many of society's most pressing problems and open new frontiers for future generations. The foundational research for the technologies of tomorrow, whether it be in chemistry, the life sciences, big data, AI or machine learning, quantum computing, or material science, is currently underway at universities across America and elsewhere. This research and this translation will have a profound impact on society, including climate change, sustainability, and cybersecurity. Yet, it is of tremendous importance that all of society has the opportunity to participate in defining and developing new technologies, as well as their use in society. We know, based on peer-reviewed academic literature, that this is currently not the case. At the outset of the research, innovation, and entrepreneurship pipeline, African-American researchers do not receive the same level of federal support, even when all other factors are held constant, as evident by a recent report from the National Institutes of Health. This fact, in turn, combined with other factors, results in the significant underrepresentation of African Americans in innovation and entrepreneurship, especially with regards to deep tech or tough tech, as it is called. This is not good for society as a whole. Institutions of higher education must do their part to not only train the next generation of scholars and thinkers in a more diverse and inclusive environment, but also increase their efforts to ensure a greater number of participants from underrepresented groups in the engine of research, innovation, and entrepreneurship. The first step in this process is to broaden the awareness of how one goes from foundational research to entrepreneurship and how to engage with an ecosystem in which universities support. In this regard, Empower 2021 conference is designed as a sort of blueprint on how one navigates and plugs into the academic innovation pipeline. The conference will focus on 3 stages of academic entrepreneurship. First, launching a startup. Second, funding its growth through successive fundraising and technology development. And third, scaling the organization. Sessions in this conference will include technology transfer, non-dilutive funding, accelerators with an emphasis on diversity, corporate partnerships, and a founders panel, just to name a few. The conference will also include a pitch competition and curated one-on-one meetings between tech founders and members of the VC community. Now, while academic institutions must play a part in educating and supporting diverse talent and innovators, as well as growing the innovation ecosystem, they will in fact not do it alone. This will only be achieved in partnership between academia, nonprofits, government, and industry. That is why we're delighted that Empower will also feature high-level conversations about the challenges and opportunities that present themselves that will require our collective efforts to achieve success. I truly hope that this conference is impactful for everyone. Now, before we begin, it is important that I thank and acknowledge those who have made this conference possible. First, I would like to acknowledge the conference organizers. They include Anne-Marie Maman, Don Seitz, Grace Penn, and Kevin Hudson of Princeton University, the entire Princeton Entrepreneurship Council team, Dennis Bronley, founder and chairman of the African American Irish Diaspora, Brent Henry, a member of Mintz Law Firm, Ita Equidum, a partner at Gingerbread Capital, Daniel Barker of Mastercard, and Lawrence Latimer, a co-founder and co-chair of the Princeton Alumni Angels. And finally, I would like to acknowledge the sponsors of the Empower Conference. They include Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, the National Urban League, Foundation for Health Advancement, Mintz Law Firm, and Eisner Amper. It is now my honor to open the conference with the first session titled Minding the Gaps, Creating Opportunities. I'd like to welcome Gaby Sulzberger and Mike Froman to join me on the virtual stage. In brief, Gaby is a senior advisor at 2 Sigma Impact, a trustee of the Ford Foundation, and a board member of several Fortune 500 enterprises. Mike is the vice chairman of strategic growth at Mastercard and president of Mastercard's Center for Inclusive Growth. You can learn more about our distinguished guests on the events management platform from which you are watching this session. And before we begin, I'd like to remind members of the audience that you may submit questions via the Q&A feature on Zoom. Gaby and Mike, thank you for joining us to kick off the Empower 2021 conference. I'm very delighted to have you. Now, as we start this conversation, I'd like to direct a general question at the both of you. You both have had and continue to have distinguished careers in corporate America, serving in some of the most senior roles that has given you a unique viewpoint of the innovation and entrepreneurship landscape. You have also spent a lot of time thinking about the issue of inclusion and equity. Can you share a bit about what you see as the challenges and opportunities in achieving inclusive and equitable access and growth? And I'd like to start with you, Gaby.
Sure. Well, thank you. And first of all, thank you very much for giving for the organizers of this conference and having the opportunity to speak to this group. And Rod, you actually missed one of my most important bio that I'm class of 81. So there's that.
That is right. I like to make this not too much about Princeton.
but yeah, so the data on this has been clear for so long, right? That diversity and inclusion gets better financial performance outcomes. We know this, but as Pablo said at the outset, what's really changed, I think, in the last year after the murder of George Floyd and the events that kind of happened around that was that really a veil was lifted. And so that there is I think a much clearer, at least in the boardrooms in which I sit, clearer recognition about how broad and pervasive, these issues are. And along with that has come a real drumbeat of pressure that's been really helpful, actually, from a combination of employees and customers and and institutional investors. And so we are really, I think, at a moment, and whether or not we are, kind of in academia or corporate boardrooms or, one of the areas that, we'll be talking about quite a bit more, which is kind of the world of entrepreneurship. We know that change is difficult. It always has been. And so, with this, there is nothing that's new about that. Just as we kind of look at other kind of, ways in which we've had kind of systemic change, we know that there are some common themes around being persistent. And in this case, I think a theme that I see that cuts across is one of intention. And I know we're going to talk about it a little bit more. We talk about corporate boards and, some of what we're seeing in the area of governance, a world that I have spent a lot of time personally is, in this of entrepreneurship and access to capital. And I know Mike is going to touch on that too. But I think this, when we talk about it, intention, one of the things that we've seen really over decades is that Black and Brown entrepreneurs, for all their brilliance, for all their innovation, we have not had the same access to both capital and opportunity. And so that is a piece that, I think is going to require, and we are beginning to see a lot more intent around. And the good news, I think, about that is, these the VC firms and the PE firms, they're very smart people. They have a lot of resources. They're really good. When they have an intention around something, like vaccine related stuff, wow, they went out, they were able to identify all kinds of new, entrepreneur groups and resources and investment opportunities, because thematically they understood it would be an opportunity to create real alpha, right? So I do believe that, as, kind of there is increasing pressure. I do think it will require pressure, but as there is, increased pressure to make sure that that same opportunity set also, is available to diverse entrepreneurs, to Black and Brown entrepreneurs in particular, that, that they do have playbooks that will allow them, that allow the firms to be more intentional about making sure that the entrepreneurs that they are supporting, again, both in access to capital and opportunities, because that's a big part of what they do, reflects all of that. So I know there's more to say about it, but yeah, but I think, but I am encouraged.
Great. Thanks, Gaby, for those intro comments. Mike, what about you? What do you see as the challenges and opportunities for achieving inclusion and equitable access and growth?
Sure. Well, again, thank you for having me as well. And class of 85, by the way. Look, let me first put it in perhaps a broader context. If we look back over the last 75 years, it's been a remarkable period of economic growth around the world, the greatest alleviation of poverty in human history. But that growth has not been always broadly shared. It has not been equal. And we've seen widening income inequality between countries and within countries. And certainly Black and brown communities in the United States have suffered the most from that. When we look at the challenge now, there are still more than 1 billion people in the world who have no access to financial services. And it's not just a developing country problem. Here in the US, you've got probably 30 million Americans who don't have access to affordable basic financial services. They're relying on too expensive financial services to get access to their own money, and they don't have access to capital. It's difficult to develop savings. It's difficult to develop wealth to then create that nest egg to be able to invest in entrepreneurial ventures. So there's a lot to be done just in the pure financial inclusion space to bring people into the system, give them access to the basic tools they need to have greater financial security and be able to take the kinds of risks that are necessary to be entrepreneurs. But just to build on Gaby's point, there's been intentional discrimination in the past, laws, policies. We can all point to a number of them. And then there's a lot of unintentional or unconscious bias that continues to be prevalent in these networks. Venture capital is very male and very white. And good ideas are not limited to that community. And so ensuring that you've got the kind of diversity around the table that is required to bring in a diverse set of entrepreneurs, a diverse set of good ideas, and ideas that can also serve communities that have not been fully served to date. I think that's the real opportunity there. You get a diverse group of people around the table who are helping to design products to tap new markets, including markets of color, and also then support entrepreneurs from those communities who can really develop those businesses and create that entrepreneurial culture.
Yeah, make a really good point, Mike. As someone who works in academia and thinks about often where good ideas come from, it's clear that diversity is a major component of where good ideas come from. And the greater the diversity in the room, the greater the ideas and the greater the innovations, et cetera. So I want to switch gears a little bit, and the name of this session is minding the gaps. And so I want to talk about the gaps and how we may overcome these gaps. And so, Gaby, in a recent New York Times article, you were quoted as saying, "I didn't know how bad it would be, but I knew it would be bad." This statement was made in regards to the lack of diversity on boards of privately held enterprises. This may also be true for publicly held enterprises. You call this issue the governance gap. Can you elaborate a bit more on this gap and how we may think about closing it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Mike made mention of, the venture capital industries, and it's true of private equity as well, which are by vast majority, teamed by white men. And so there are a number of byproducts around that creates, kind of what you've described as gap. But I want to start by just saying, this is a category of capital that, is really important. It fuels growth, it fuels innovation, and so has really, truly outsized impact in our economy. And so the data, and it's true of public companies as well, the difference is there's a level of accountability and transparency that public companies, have, kind of live with because they're regulated and all that kind of jazz. Well, private companies, not so much. In fact, it's, partly their business model that they don't have that, transparency. They're able to just do a lot of stuff and they don't have to kind of report publicly about it, right? And so Ursula Burns and I began some work on this last fall, which I think is what the New York Times article is referring to. And we actually looked at the 18 leading, both in terms of the amount of capital that they manage, but also in terms of the influence that they wield, within Silicon Valley and private equity alley and the 18 leading firms. And we looked at, and in general, these firms are not at all transparent. They don't share anything, but when their company goes public, then all of a sudden, you can learn a lot. And so what we did is we looked, at all of the public companies of their portfolios over 20 years, not just a couple, but over a 20-year period. And because we thought that data would be interesting. And that was the piece that, and we thought it'd be interesting. We didn't think it'd be great. But it was really pretty terrible. And so what we saw was that of the 843 unique companies, they had a total of 4,800 directors. And of the 4,800 directors, only 49 were Black. I think it was like 47 were Hispanic. So less than 1% really of the total over a 20-year period. And we know it's fewer than 49 people because when they find somebody they like, then they ask them to serve on multiple boards. So the boards were terrible. Even worse actually was the C-suite. And so again, these 843 companies over 20 years, and C-suite is not just obviously just, CEOs, but it's general counsel and heads of HR and chief financial officers. And again, across 843 companies over 20 years, there were only 26 Black executives. That's pretty bad. So that's kind of what, I think we are dealing with. And again, like these are companies that, represent $11 trillion in market cap. They employ a lot of people. So we do think that there is a systemic, issue with these firms. And, in addition to, I think the numbers are kind of less than 2% in terms of entrepreneur founder groups that are diverse. How they are running their portfolio companies also, kind of reflect this very narrow mindset. And we think that ultimately really is a governance challenge.
So what you describe is a very large gap. When you say 4,800 directors, 49 may have been Black and 47 have been Hispanic. And then also over that same time period, 27 Black or 26 Black executives in the C-suite. So that's a pretty large gap, so a pretty large governance gap. You mentioned this organization you founded with Ursula Burns. Is that one way in which we could think about closing this gap?
Yeah, and I will say, over the months, we have been meeting individually with a number of the firms. And so the organization that, we work with is the Board Diversity Action Alliance, and so are providing a number of resources. And there's some other groups out there that are doing really tremendous work, but we are working with the firms, and you won't be surprised, there's a continuum. Some of them are quite interested in getting engaged. Some are recognizing that they have real issues, and it will just take time. As we said earlier, it requires intention. But I'm also here to say there's some really major firms that still don't have that much interest, don't have the kind of motivation that we were talking about earlier to really do the work. And so they run the gamut, and I'm just hopeful. And part of the reason we are spending as much time as we are at this point, just kind of talking about this data, is that there's a role for, the endowments of the world, the Princetons of the world, to ask these questions of their LPs, kind of about their portfolios. How are they, what do the executive teams look like? What are the boards like? These are just questions to ask that I think are really indicative. And just by virtue of asking the questions, I think you start to create accountability with the firms.
Definitely. Mike, Mastercard has pledged to help close the racial wealth gap as well as the opportunity gap for Black communities across America. Can you describe these gaps in a little bit more and offer ways in which we may close them?
Sure. I think in response to the George Floyd murder, Mastercard, like many other companies, made major commitments and announcements about what they wanted to do on the racial opportunity and wealth gap. But I have to say, it's more important than commitments or writing checks. It's bringing the whole company into the issue and doing it in a genuine and authentic way. And we've chosen to do this by really focusing on 7 cities around the country. And to answer your question, it starts with better information. So using data insights to understand what has been the impact, for example, of COVID on different communities in a city. What communities are lagging behind in terms of the recovery? Where is growth happening and where is that growth inclusive? We're not pushing people out of neighborhoods. How do we help mayors and cities develop policies that can really help promote that kind of inclusive growth so that people can benefit from home ownership, from wealth creation in their community, from the kind of economic development activity that might happen in that community. I think secondly, there's a need to invest in Black-owned firms and to help them scale. There are a lot of small businesses. There's been a lot of small business creation actually during COVID by Black small business owners. But to get to scale, it requires additional investment. So investing in things like the Fearless Fund, which is a fund that focuses on female entrepreneurs of color, or the Greenwood Bank, which is targeting the African American community. I think that is a step that can be taken to use Gaby's words, intentionally focus on where we're putting our investment dollars. There's a whole issue around product development and being intentionally inclusive in that product development. So partnering with groups like Mocafy, Mobility Capital Finance, that's focused on bringing financial services into Black and brown communities around the United States, or Goal Setters, which focuses on financial security of families of color. And then lifting up, really using the bully pulpit, the marketing to lift up women of color, for example, women of color, small business owners, and making sure that they are getting the profile and are serving as an example and getting the support they need to be able to grow. All those things can happen. I'll mention one other thing that we do, but I think a number of others can do in the private sector. We have a program called StarPath, which is about providing support for Series A and earlier startups. And we took a hard look at our StarPath program as part of this In Solidarity effort, and became much more intentional about how we market to Black and brown entrepreneurs, how we do due diligence, and to Gaby's point, look at the makeup of management teams and whether they're on a path towards greater diversity, how we make sure there's inclusive leadership in these areas, and then doing a very focused StarPath round to really focus on entrepreneurs of color to ensure that they have the same opportunities that others do to get on that path towards attracting capital and scaling up.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Mike. Mastercard was recently in the news for their support of HBCUs and entrepreneurship at HBCUs. Can you talk a little bit more about how Mastercard is building greater inclusion and innovation and entrepreneurship through its support of HBCUs?
Sure. I'll give 2 examples. We recently announced support for Morehouse and Spelman to create a Center for Black Entrepreneurship in Atlanta. And the goal there is to really provide education, mentorship, access to capital for students and faculty of those 2 HBCUs, so that they can, again, get in those networks and be noticed by people who have capital to deploy. I'm also excited about a partnership we have with Howard University to create a Center for Applied Data Science and Analytics. And there, the goal is to really focus on issues of racial bias, of exclusion, of fraud that's targeting communities, using the tools of data science, using AI, using machine learning to make sure that credit decisions, for example, are done in a non-biased way. We get to the algorithmic bias question through that. And that fraud that is targeting Black communities is identified quickly and dealt with. I think there's a great opportunity, again, to take strength of the students and the faculty at HBCUs and make sure that they have a pathway towards good careers in technology, whether it's at big companies or at startups.
Thank you for that, Mike. Gaby, oftentimes when entrepreneurs want to create a new startup, people will often say, well, start with friends and family. And that's the assumption that, well, you have friends and family that actually have access
A lot of money, right?
to capital, right? And so you touched upon this a little bit in terms of the lack of funding for women and minority founders that's coming from the VC community. We have a lot of entrepreneurs in attendance today. As someone like yourself who's had quite a bit of experience in the VC community, I'd like to ask, how do we increase the pipeline of deal flow for Black founders, and how do we reduce this implicit bias in the investment community?
Yeah. I mean, I think the deal flow is out there. Like, I am always impressed whenever right, the quality and quantity of really interesting, Black and brown and female kind of founders and innovators that are out there. And I think that the disconnect really is in kind of their access to these firms, because these firms are highly, highly relationship driven. They're not making investment decisions. It's not like a loan where there's a checklist and, there's formulas and stuff. It's very much relationship driven, and I'll just say, like, kind of one anecdote is when I graduated from school many years ago, and I'd worked at Bain, and I'd have the credentials, I thought, and I kind of thought, oh, I'm going to work in venture capital because it just seems interesting. And it was just this incredible club. I've never gotten so much rejection in my life as I did when I naively thought, oh, I'm just going to get a job in venture capital. And anyway, it ended up working out. But the real, kind of wake up call for me was just a few years ago when my daughter graduated from Harvard Business School. And, again, she had great credentials, and, she thought like she wanted to go to venture capital, and Harvard does like a day where they meet with a whole bunch of firms and stuff. And she came back, from this visit to Silicon Valley, and she said, Mom, like, I was all day and I didn't see one Black person. And I think there was one woman, and I wasn't even sure if she was like and it's a real issue, 25 years later. And so I think ultimately, until that changes, because of the nature of the industry, it's just going to be a slugfest. There's, in the interim, like, what do Black founders do? We do what we do. We have chutzpah. We go, we do these pitches, and there's like, it's not a diverse group, and we kind of work through it. But to the longer term answer really is structurally, because it is a relationship, industry, is we do need to make these firms, we need to see more diverse at the firms themselves. And I think part of the way that happens is going to be, again, kind of pressure and interest and being held accountable from their investors. And so I think we are beginning to see that happen.
Excellent, thanks. I like that quote, we do what we do, we overcome, for sure. We are nearing the end of my time to be able to ask questions, but I do want to ask a few more. So maybe we'll keep these relatively brief and make sure that we leave some time for Q&A from the audience. I feel like, since 2020 or summer 2020, we've certainly been living in a moment of time in which there's been arguably no more greater attention and focus on racial equity in the US. Certainly this is true for recent times. And so my question to each of you, and I'll start with you first, Gaby, is how do we sustain this momentum? How do we make sure this is not a moment of time? How do we make sure that an institution like Princeton stays committed to the announcements that my colleague Pablo De Benedetti announced early on? And this is not something we do for a short period of time, but this is something that Princeton, as well as other institutions, industry, government, et cetera, remain committed to greater equity in the US.
Well, like I said at the outset, I am optimistic, and well, I'm optimistic by nature, but I'm optimistic at this particular moment. And I've been doing board work actually for 20 years. I've not seen a moment like this. I've not seen kind of this level of, I don't know, just intent. And as a result, I do think that what we are seeing is some structural change. We are seeing, at the governance level, Black and Brown directors being placed on board at a rate that's just unforeseen, unprecedented. And that's good, and that's important, and that endures. And similarly, we are seeing, some accession and real progress in the executive suites as well. And so that kind of structural, change encourages me that it will endure. I think it behooves each of us in our own ways, like, to take advantage of this moment and do all we can, in whatever ways we can. But what makes me encouraged is the amount of structural change that we are seeing right now. And if that's in academia and corporate boards, I think we're even beginning to see it in the world of, venture capital and private equity. But boy, it's slow. But we are beginning to see structural change, and that is what makes me optimistic.
Excellent. And the structural change is definitely what we need. So, Mike, what about you? How do we, sustain the momentum and make sure this is not just a moment in time?
Yeah, look, I agree with Gaby. And one of my colleagues asked me the other day, what happens when our 5-year In Solidarity plan is over? And it's not as though we're going to have bridged the opportunity and wealth gap in 5 years. And my answer was, it's not about renewing special initiatives like this. It's about making them a core part of the business to begin with. And to me, that will be the success. That will make this sustainable over the long run, is if companies, as one example, but it could be universities or governments, begin to view these issues around racial equity in the same way that we're now viewing a number of other ESG issues that have to be core to the business, deep integrated into everything we do, from our personnel practices, our risk management, our product development, our marketing, et cetera. That will be the success. That will keep it going for as long as it needs to go on until those gaps are actually bridged.
Excellent. Great. Well, now my final question to each of you, and I'd ask you to keep it to 1 minute each. What can members of the audience do as individuals or as representatives of their organizations to contribute to the solutions to the challenges we've identified? I'll start with you, Mike.
Look, I think the watchword of today is intentionality. And I think being intentional in your hiring practice. And I see it in my own organizations I've worked for. When you reach that tipping point where you have senior, diverse people around the table, it becomes a flywheel and you begin to see that diversity throughout the whole organization. So making sure you're hiring, developing, promoting, retaining, and empowering your diverse employees so that they become a key part of furthering that diversity going forward.
Thank you. And to you, Gaby?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think I look in almost, there are all kinds of areas. If it's your day job, if it's what's happening in your kid's school, if it's, right now, there is an openness, there is, kind of opportunity. And so I do think just taking a little bit of chance and putting, creating some attention around it and speaking up and getting involved and doing whatever it is you can right in through here to move this needle.
Definitely. Thank you both. And so I'd now like to turn it over to my colleague, Anne-Marie Maman, who will share questions from members of the audience.
Thanks, great discussion. So I'm going to go to the first question that comes from David Stengel. David asks, can you speak to measurement initiatives for the governance gap, such as diversity.vc?
Yeah. So for example, the Board Diversity Action Alliance, the metrics we've been really focused on has been number of Black and Brown directors, and so we have done and the call to action was that, we believe there should be at least 2 on every board. And so as we've gone out and kind of looked at the world, that is a particular metric that we've been, really focused on. As I said earlier, we also now are beginning to and plan on reporting annually on C-suite executives within private, companies. And again, these are just companies, that are, now public, because that's the only place that we have data. But I think those are really the key metrics, is both diversity as it relates to board and executives in the C-suite. And at least as it relates to public companies, that is data that's available.
Thanks. Second question comes from Spencer. Spencer asks, are there current legislative proposals in Congress that you feel will be helpful in addressing the gaps, whether related to the Biden infrastructure and jobs agenda or otherwise?
I'm not familiar with anything very specific in that regard. I would say that a number of the proposals that go to strengthening the social safety net, creating pathways towards greater financial security, I think those address some of the underlying obstacles to people creating wealth, maintaining wealth, and being able then to take the kinds of risks to support entrepreneurial activity themselves along the way. So I think those sort of initiatives that address the gaps to access, both access to the system, access to capital, I think those can be very positive.
And look, devil's in the details, and much of this has not been sorted out yet. I think something that's not happened heretofore in the past with some of these, kind of big, is that the opportunities are, that to the extent wealth is created, that those are not opportunities that are always, availed to all. And so I think one of the areas that we will be really attentive to is whether or not, as these programs are put in place, whether or not there truly is a commitment to making sure that there is kind of a diverse group of entrepreneurs and business folks that are taking, or are being able to participate, in this economic activity.
Great. Mike Ehrlich asks, how can we leverage our public education system to foster intentionality and inclusivity?
You want to take that one, Gaby?
That is a
Big question.
That's a pretty big question. Yeah, I think, you would really start you would start early, and, you have to actually, start with teachers. And, Mike was talking earlier about the extent to which, unfortunately, unconscious bias, even, kind of assuming kind of best of intentions and best of goodwill, unconscious bias is, alive and well in America. And so, the extent to which we can, identify, and it's a system that, has got so much financial pressure on it to begin with, but to the extent we can identify resources to make sure, that, the professionals within the education system, have a support around unconscious bias and training around unconscious bias, is an important place to start.
An add-on question for me is does it also come back to rewriting or correcting some of the history and some of the and an understanding for the students themselves?
Mike?
Well, look, I think there have been some helpful efforts to really go back and see where there is bias, both as Abby said, in the hiring and but also in some of the curricula. And so doing that in a thoughtful way so that students are exposed to the wide variety of perspectives, I think is going to be important as well. I mean, we have just to take a step back, we've seen such polarization in our society more broadly, and we've lost a little bit of the muscle of understanding alternative perspectives. And so trying to be, again, intentional in our education system about ensuring that there is exposure to these alternative perspectives, and that there is an understanding of a habit of tolerance and inclusion in there would be positive as well.
Thank you. Jay Terry asks, is the lack of attendance at VC fairs related to lack of invitations or lack of awareness by Black graduates? And how do we fix either of those?
Honestly, I don't know how that's been managed at Princeton, and whether or not, the word has been disseminated in ways that really gets people where they actually are. My assumption is not that, it would be a lack of interest, because in my experience, Black and Brown, students, maybe even more so than, their peers, for us being entrepreneurial, is often a way of, of social and economic mobility. So I wouldn't assume that it's lack of interest. I think it could be lack of awareness. And then I think the other thing to, that sometimes, again, not conscious, but, we create these forums out of good intent, but we need to understand how they're being set up to make sure they actually truly are conducive, and, feel, inclusive, to all. So my inclination would be kind of a combination of how the word is being disseminated, and then kind of what the setup is for the events that make people feel included, and that, their participation is valued.
The next question is more of a practical how-to question. So as a Black founder, how do I get plugged into the StarPath? Your program StarPath. What should I do to get onto your radar?
I'm sure somehow through this conference, you can get me a message, send me an email, and I will forward it to the right people who run the StarPath program. I welcome that.
And just a little plug for it, we were talking about it earlier. And there are programs at other large companies, not a lot. Like, I think of StarPath as one of the best, but what they've identified, as we were saying earlier, is that access to capital is a real thing, and so StarPath and other programs like that provide. But it turns out that, in the VC ecosystem, it's not just about capital that they're providing, right? It's like introductions, and it's business introductions, and it's, help. And so it's all of that other stuff that a program like StarPath and introduction to potential, customer relationships, that bit is very, very valuable as well. And so we need to figure out, and that's, again, part of what the VC ecosystem does, for, these entrepreneurs. And that's what we really need to make sure, we make available to Black and Brown entrepreneurs as well.
Right. And there's one other practical question. Can the enterprise be cross-situated in both the US and Africa to be eligible?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, we also have a StarPath program in Africa. We have regional specific, we have global. It's around fintech, as you might imagine, things related to payments broadly, but we do have programs in Africa as well. In fact, we have a financial inclusion lab in Nairobi that's all about creating products appropriate for financial inclusion.
Great. And somebody did ask about whether the organizations mentioned throughout the sessions, if they'll have access, a list of these. I'm assuming that they can also go, Mike, to your website and find a list of these specifically that you're working with. Is that right?
They should be able to, but if they have trouble finding any of them, let me know, and I'll make sure they get introduced.
Super. Great. Okay, so that is the end of our questions. Rod, I think you're going to come back on. There we are. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for leading the Q&A from the audience. And I certainly want to thank Gaby and Mike for taking the time to share their insights into how we grow and sustain a more inclusive innovation ecosystem. This is certainly something that's of tremendous importance to us here at Princeton University, and I'm sure to the members in the audience as well. I know that I speak for everyone in attendance in thanking you for your leadership and support for creating more opportunities for underrepresented innovators and entrepreneurs that overall make our society more equitable and competitive. This is something that's of importance for society as a whole, not just for Black and brown and women innovators and entrepreneurs, but for innovation and for the US to remain competitive, et cetera. So that ends our session. Please enjoy the rest of the conference, including the next session that starts at 1 p.m. on technology transfer for academic startups. Thank you. Best wishes.